the man who seemed incorruptible. In the beginning, Anthony Morris III was the picture of devotion. A man who seemed carved from stone, unshakable in his faith, unwavering in his commitment. When he spoke from the platform at conventions, his voice carried a weight that silenced thousands. There was something about him, a severity, a gravity, that made people believe every word came directly from heaven itself. He wasn't the warm, approachable member of the governing body. He wasn't the one who smiled easily or softened his message for modern ears. No, Anthony Morris was the prophet of fire and brimstone, the one who spoke the hard truths that others were too weak to say. He denounced sin with the passion of an Old Testament judge. He warned against pride, against the pursuit of wealth, against the seductive pull of the world and its empty promises. And for decades, the congregation believed in him. They saw him as an example of purity, a man who had truly renounced the world to live only for God. While others might stumble, while others might compromise, Anthony Morris stood firm. Or so it seemed. But what nobody saw, what took years to emerge from behind the carefully constructed image, is that the temptation of power doesn't always announce itself with money. It doesn't always arrive in a briefcase full of cash or a bank account swollen with excess. No, sometimes the corruption is far more subtle. It begins when a man starts to believe too much in his own holiness. When he confuses his position with righteousness. When the applause of thousands starts to sound like the approval of God. The descent doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, almost imperceptible. One small compromise leads to another. One privilege justified leads to the next. And before long, the man who once preached against the world finds himself more comfortable in it than he ever imagined. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Anthony Morris became a symbol of everything he claimed to oppose, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when he was just another faithful servant, climbing the ranks of an organization that promised spiritual paradise but delivered something far more complicated. Anthony Morris didn't start at the top. Like many who eventually reach positions of authority within the Watchtower organization, he spent decades proving his loyalty, demonstrating his commitment, showing that he could be trusted with greater responsibility. He served as a regular pioneer, dedicating countless hours to door-to-door ministry. He worked his way through various positions: ministerial servant, elder, circuit overseer. Each step up the ladder required sacrifice, demanded obedience, tested his willingness to put the organization above everything else, including his own family. And he passed every test. Or perhaps more accurately, he learned how to appear as though he passed every test. When Morris was selected to join the governing body in 2005, it seemed like divine appointment. The humble servant had now become one of the most influential voices in the entire organization. One of just 7 men who claimed to be the sole channel of communication between God and humanity. One of the few who interpreted Scripture for 8 million believers worldwide. Think about that for a moment. 8 million people, in virtually every country on earth, waiting for these 7 men to tell them what God wants. What to believe, how to behave, who to avoid, how to raise their children, whether they can accept medical treatment, whether they should pursue education, whether they can speak to their own family members. The power is staggering, absolute and unquestionable. Because to challenge the governing body isn't just to disagree with a religious leader, it's to rebel against Jehovah himself. But power, as they say, reveals character. And with Morris's elevation to the governing body came privileges that few outside the organization could imagine. Comfortable homes maintained by the organization. Cars always at his disposal. Constant travel to exotic locations under the banner of spiritual oversight. First-class treatment wherever he went. The best seats, the finest accommodations, the type of access and comfort that most witnesses could never dream of. And here's where the transformation began to take root. Because Morris still preached about humility, still warned against materialism, still condemned those who sought comfort and security in this dying world. But now he did it from a place where nobody could question him. From a position so elevated, so protected, that criticism was impossible. The distance between the platform and the people grew wider with each passing year. The man who once knocked on doors like everyone else now lived in a world completely removed from the struggles of ordinary witnesses. He no longer worried about making rent, about affording groceries, about whether he could fix his aging car. Those concerns belonged to the rank and file, to the publishers who sacrificed their futures to pioneer, who worked menial jobs so they could devote more time to the ministry, who postponed education and career and family planning because the governing body told them the end was coming any day now. But for Morris and his colleagues at headquarters, life was different. Comfortable. Secure. And as the years passed, that comfort began to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like an entitlement. Vanity, you see, doesn't always look like gold chains and sports cars. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie. Sometimes it speaks from behind a podium. Sometimes it hides behind the language of spirituality while indulging in the very things it condemns. And privilege, once tasted, is remarkably difficult to renounce. If you've ever watched Anthony Morris deliver a talk, you know what intensity looks like. The man was relentless. Uncompromising. He didn't soften his message, didn't worry about hurt feelings or modern sensibilities. In his worldview, there were the faithful and there were the apostates, and the line between them was razor-thin. He condemned materialism with a fury that seemed almost personal. Young people who wanted to pursue higher education? Foolish, spiritually dangerous, seduced by Satan's world. Witnesses who took jobs that paid well or offered security. Lacking faith, prioritizing comfort over the kingdom. Brothers and sisters who bought nice homes or drove decent cars. Clearly not keeping their eye simple, not truly trusting in Jehovah's provision. His most famous talk, the one that went viral among ex-witness communities, was the tight pants discourse. Standing before thousands at a convention, Morris railed against young men wearing skinny jeans, claiming they were designed by homosexual fashion designers to make men look attractive to other men. It was bizarre, uncomfortable, and revealed an obsession with control that extended even to the clothing choices of adult men. But that was just one example. Over the years, Morris delivered countless talks warning against virtually every aspect of modern life. Higher education? A trap. Entertainment? Dangerous. Personal ambition? Sinful. Even saving money for the future showed a lack of faith in the imminent arrival of Armageddon. The message was clear. Sacrifice everything, live simply, trust in the organization, and wait for the new world that was always just around the corner. But when the cameras turned off, when the convention crowds dispersed, when Morris returned to his private life behind the walls of Watchtower headquarters, something changed. The severity softened. The standards bent. The rules that applied to everyone else somehow didn't apply quite the same way to him. Testimonies from former Beth elites, those who worked at headquarters and saw behind the curtain, began to paint a different picture. They spoke of a man with expensive tastes, someone who enjoyed the finer things in life more than his public persona would ever suggest. There was the infamous incident that became a symbol of his hypocrisy: Anthony Morris walking out of a liquor store carrying multiple bottles of premium whiskey. The video, captured by a chance observer and posted online, showed him loading his cart with top-shelf spirits. Not a single bottle for a quiet evening, but case quantities of expensive alcohol. Now, drinking alcohol isn't inherently wrong, even within Watchtower doctrine. But there's something deeply troubling about a man who lives in a world of privilege, who has never struggled financially, who is supported entirely by the donations of hard-working witnesses. Many of them poor, many of them sacrificing their own comfort, spending hundreds of dollars on luxury liquor while simultaneously condemning others for pursuing even modest financial security. Former headquarters staff reported other details. Designer clothes, though always conservative in style. A taste for premium food and drink at Bethel dining facilities where such things were available to the leadership. A comfort level with privilege that seemed entirely at odds with his public message. This is the man who told young people not to pursue careers, who told families not to plan for retirement, who warned against saving money or owning property. And yet he himself lived in accommodation he would never have to pay for, ate food he would never have to buy, and enjoyed a level of financial security that his own teachings would deny to millions of his followers. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. But what's even more troubling is how normalized this had become within the organization's leadership. Because Morris wasn't an exception. He was simply the one who got caught on camera. The double standard was built into the system itself. The governing body lived lives completely disconnected from the sacrifices they demanded of others. They spoke about trusting Jehovah while enjoying guaranteed security. They warned against material comfort while surrounding themselves with it. They preached about simplicity while their rooms were cleaned, their meals prepared, their travel arranged, and their every need met by an army of volunteers who worked for free, believing they were serving God. And perhaps the most insidious part of all this is how it was justified. Not just by Morris, but by those around him, by the system that protected him, by the culture of unquestioning obedience that made criticism impossible. He deserves it, some would say. He's worked so hard for the organization. It's not really his, others would argue. It all belongs to Jehovah. He's just using what's been provided. But these are the same justifications corrupt leaders have used throughout history. The same logic that allows televangelists to live in mansions while their congregations struggle to pay bills. The same reasoning that protected Catholic bishops in their palaces while peasants starved. And Anthony Morris, the man who seemed incorruptible, had become just another example of power corrupting, privilege blinding, and authority insulating itself from accountability. Inside Bethel, the sprawling headquarters complex in Warwick, New York, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. People saw them every day. The disparity between the message and the reality. The gap between the standards applied to the rank and file and those applied to the leadership. But here's the thing about authoritarian systems. They don't survive because everyone believes the lie. They survive because speaking the truth is too dangerous. Who would dare to challenge a member of the governing body? Who would risk everything? Their position, their reputation, their entire social network, to point out that the emperor had no clothes. To question the governing body within Watchtower culture is to question God himself. These men are presented not as fallible humans making organizational decisions, but as the direct representatives of Jehovah on earth. To doubt them is apostasy. To criticize them is rebellion. To expose their hypocrisy is to wage war against God's anointed. So the silence became self-enforcing. It became the safest path, the only rational choice for those who wanted to keep their place in the organization, who wanted to maintain their relationships, who couldn't afford to lose everything they'd built their lives around. Some convinced themselves it wasn't that bad. He probably needs to relax somehow. We don't know the full story. It's not our place to judge. The rationalizations piled up, each one making it easier to ignore what was right in front of them. Others simply looked away. They focused on their own work, their own faith, their own relationship with God, and pretended not to see the contradictions. Cognitive dissonance is painful, and sometimes the human mind chooses comfortable delusion over difficult truth. And then there were those who knew, who saw, who felt the wrongness of it all, but who stayed silent out of fear. Fear of being disfellowshipped. Fear of being labeled an apostate. Fear of losing contact with their families, their friends, everyone they'd ever known. Because that's the ultimate weapon in the Watchtower's arsenal. The shunning policy. Step out of line, and you don't just lose your position. You lose everything. Your parents won't speak to you. Your children might refuse to see you. Your lifelong friends will cross the street to avoid you. You become dead to everyone you love, a cautionary tale, a warning to others about what happens when you question those in authority. This is how corruption persists. Not through elaborate conspiracies, but through the simple mechanism of making truth-telling too costly. When the price of honesty is social death, most people choose silence. And so Anthony Morris continued year after year, delivering stern lectures about materialism while enjoying material comfort, warning against worldly ambition while wielding enormous organizational power, preaching about humility while basking in the adulation of millions. The system protected him. The culture enabled him. And the silence of those who knew became his greatest shield. But here's what nobody at headquarters could have predicted. The internet was changing everything. Videos could be recorded on phones. Screenshots could be captured and shared. Former members could connect with each other, compare notes, and piece together the truth that the organization had worked so hard to hide. The walls that once kept secrets safe were crumbling. And when that video of Morris emerged, walking out of a liquor store with his expensive purchases, looking startled when he realized he'd been spotted, it became a symbol of everything the organization tried to deny. This wasn't just about alcohol. It was about the lie they'd all been told. The lie that the leaders lived as simply as everyone else. The lie that sacrifice was equally shared. The lie that those at the top were there because of their humility rather than their ambition. And once that lie was exposed, Others began to speak up. Former Bethelites shared their stories. Ex-members compared notes about what they'd seen. The whispers became conversations. The conversations became testimonies. And slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. Anthony Morris wasn't the humble servant he'd portrayed himself to be. He was a man who enjoyed power, who had grown comfortable with privilege, who had convinced himself that he deserved the pedestal others had placed him on. The silence was finally breaking. But as we'll see, the organization's response to this exposure would reveal even more about how power protects itself, how institutions prioritize their own survival over accountability, and how those at the top remain insulated even when the truth about them can no longer be hidden. Picture two versions of the same man, existing simultaneously, somehow never quite touching. On one side, you have the public Anthony Morris, the stern prophet, the uncompromising voice of righteousness, the man who delivers blistering condemnations of anything that smacks of worldliness or compromise. This Morris stands before crowds of thousands and warns them about the dangers of comfort, the seduction of material things, the deadly trap of pursuing security in Satan's dying system. He tells young people not to go to university because 4 years is too long to wait when Armageddon is imminent. He instructs families not to save for retirement because the new world will arrive before they grow old. He warns against buying property, building careers, planning for the future. Put the kingdom first, he says. Sacrifice everything. Trust in Jehovah. The end is so close now, so very close, that any investment in this world is a waste. This Morris is all fire and judgment. There's no room for nuance, no space for compromise. You're either all in or you're spiritually dead. It's black and white, right and wrong, faithful or apostate. But then there's the other Morris. The private one. The one who lives behind the protected walls of headquarters, insulated from the consequences of his own teachings. This Morris never has to worry about health care because it's provided. Never has to think about retirement because his housing, food, and care are guaranteed for life. Never has to make the agonizing choices that ordinary witnesses face every day, whether to take their sick child to the doctor or wait and trust in prayer, whether to work overtime to pay the rent or skip it to attend meetings, whether to save money for the future or donate it to the organization. This Morris drinks expensive whiskey, wears quality clothing, travels comfortably, and lives in accommodations that most witnesses would consider luxurious. He doesn't experience the struggle he demands of others. He's never had to choose between spiritual devotion and financial survival because the organization has ensured he never has to make that choice. And perhaps most tellingly, this Morris seems to have convinced himself that he deserves it. That his position, his authority, his supposed direct connection to God somehow justifies the disparity. That the rules he enforces on others don't quite apply to him in the same way. This is the anatomy of religious hypocrisy. It's not always about conscious deception. Often, it's about a slow, steady process of self-justification. A man starts with genuine faith, but over time, the elevation to power begins to warp his perspective. The praise starts to feel like validation. The privilege starts to feel earned. The distance from ordinary life starts to feel appropriate, even necessary. He's told himself a story, and after enough years, he believes it. The story goes something like this: I've sacrificed so much for the organization. I've given my entire life to this work. I've earned the right to a few comforts. This isn't luxury, it's simply what's appropriate for my position. I'm not like those materialistic people in the world. I don't own these things, the organization does. I'm just a humble servant using what's been provided. But the mental gymnastics required to maintain this narrative are extraordinary. How do you condemn materialism while surrounded by material comfort? How do you warn against seeking security while enjoying total security? How do you preach sacrifice while making none? The answer is compartmentalization. You create two separate realities in your mind and never let them touch. In one compartment, you're the righteous prophet, God's spokesman, the fearless voice crying out in the wilderness. In the other compartment, you're just a man enjoying the reasonable benefits of your position. And crucially, you surround yourself with people who reinforce this delusion. People who tell you that you deserve it. People who never challenge you. People who benefit from the same system and have the same investment in maintaining it. This is how good people, Or at least people who started with good intentions end up doing terrible things. Not through dramatic moral failures, but through tiny compromises that accumulate over time. A little privilege here, a small exception there, until the gap between your words and your life becomes a chasm you can no longer see because you've trained yourself not to look. And the tragic irony is that Anthony Morris probably still sees himself as righteous. He probably believes his own narrative, has internalized his own justifications, truly thinks that his life is one of sacrifice and service rather than comfort and power. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of corruption, not the corruption that knows it's corrupt, but the corruption that believes it's holy. The book of Ecclesiastes opens with one of the most haunting lines in Scripture, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." The Hebrew word translated as vanity, hebel, literally means vapor or breath. Something that appears substantial but is actually empty, something that promises meaning but delivers nothing, something that looks impressive but dissolves the moment you try to grasp it. The writer of Ecclesiastes, traditionally identified as Solomon, had tried everything: wealth, wisdom, pleasure, power, achievement. He built great works, accumulated vast possessions, surrounded himself with everything a person could desire. And at the end of it all, he looked at what he'd achieved and saw only vapor. The story of Anthony Morris is a perfect illustration of this ancient truth. He began, presumably, with genuine devotion. A man who wanted to serve God, who believed he was doing righteous work, who saw his role in the organization as a sacred calling. But somewhere along the way, the means became the end. The position became more important than the purpose. The power became its own reward. He started preaching about humility and ended up surrounded by symbols of status. He started serving and ended up being served. He warned against vanity while building a life defined by it. And here's what makes this story so tragic. The corruption wasn't sudden or dramatic. There was no single moment where Morris woke up and decided to become a hypocrite. Instead, it was an erosion, slow and steady, almost imperceptible. A compliment here that made him feel special. A privilege there that seemed reasonable. A small exception to the rules that nobody questioned. A little more comfort that felt deserved. Each step seemed justifiable in isolation. But taken together, they added up to a complete transformation. The humble servant got lost inside his own image, buried beneath layers of self-deception and institutional enabling. The heart that was once moved by faith became captivated by something far more seductive: spiritual vanity. This is perhaps the most dangerous kind of pride because it disguises itself as righteousness. It doesn't look like arrogance, it looks like conviction. It doesn't sound like ego, it sounds like divine authority. It doesn't feel like corruption, it feels like being chosen. When a man begins to believe that he speaks for God, he stops listening to God. When he confuses his opinions with divine revelation, he becomes unteachable. When he accepts worship from others, and make no mistake, the reverence shown to the governing body is a form of worship, he loses the capacity for self-reflection. This is the birth of sacred arrogance, the most dangerous kind of all. Because at least a secular tyrant knows he's tyrannical. At least a corrupt politician understands that he's compromised. But the religious leader who has convinced himself of his own righteousness? He can justify anything. He can condemn in others what he practices himself and never see the contradiction. He can demand sacrifices he never makes and call it service to God. The Scriptures are filled with warnings about this. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. The last will be first, and the first will be last. The pattern repeats throughout biblical history. Leaders who start well and end badly, prophets who begin in humility and finish in arrogance, men of God who become intoxicated by their own authority. And now Anthony Morris has taken his place in that long, tragic tradition. Perhaps he really believed he deserved more. Perhaps he convinced himself that the comfort was a blessing, the privilege a divine provision, the power a sacred trust. Perhaps he never saw the contradiction because he couldn't afford to see it. Because seeing it would mean admitting that he'd become exactly what he condemned, that his life had become a lie, that the emperor had no clothes and he was the emperor. The Bible is brutally clear about this. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. History proves it again and again. The tower of pride always collapses. The throne of vanity never lasts. The man who plays God eventually discovers he's just a man. And that brings us to the end of Anthony Morris's story with the governing body. In 2023, he was suddenly removed from his position. No explanation given. No public statement about why. Just a brief, clinical announcement that he was no longer serving as a member of the governing body. The organization that demands transparency from its members offered none regarding one of its leaders. The same organization that requires ordinary witnesses to confess their sins and face judicial committees simply erased one of the most prominent members of its leadership without explanation. Speculation ran wild. Was it the liquor store video? Was it other behaviors that had finally become impossible to ignore? Was it internal disagreements about doctrine or policy? Was it his increasingly extreme public statements that were becoming an embarrassment? We may never know the full story. Organizations like Watchtower are expert at protecting their secrets, at controlling information, at ensuring that uncomfortable truths remain hidden. But what we do know is this: power reveals character. And over the course of his tenure on the governing body, Anthony Morris's character was revealed to be far different from the image he projected. The man who preached poverty lived in comfort. The man who condemned worldliness enjoyed worldly pleasures. The man who demanded sacrifice made none. The man who claimed to speak for God seemed more interested in the sound of his own voice. And in the end, after all the years of authority and influence, after all the lives affected by his teachings, after all the families torn apart by policies he supported, after all the young people discouraged from education because he said the end was near, after all of that, he was simply removed. Quietly, efficiently, with the same lack of transparency that characterizes every difficult moment in the organization's history. The institution moved on. New faces appeared on the broadcasts. Life at headquarters continued as if he'd never existed. Because that's how power works. The individual leader may fall, but the system that enabled him remains intact. The problems weren't just with Anthony Morris. He was a symptom, not the disease. So what do we learn from this story? What truth can we extract from this tragedy? Perhaps it's simply this: be wary of anyone who claims to speak for God. Be skeptical of anyone who demands sacrifice but makes none. Question leaders who live differently than they teach. And never, ever confuse religious authority with moral authority. The ability to interpret Scripture doesn't make someone righteous. A position of leadership doesn't confer wisdom. And the applause of crowds means nothing if the life behind the pulpit contradicts the words spoken from it. Anthony Morris started as a believer and ended as a cautionary tale. He began with conviction and finished in contradiction. He preached against vanity while embodying it. And perhaps the most sobering lesson of all is that this didn't happen because he was uniquely evil or especially corrupt. It happened because he was human. Because power corrupts. Because privilege blinds. Because when you surround yourself with people who never challenge you, you lose the ability to see yourself clearly. It could happen to anyone. It has happened to countless religious leaders throughout history. And it will happen again, as long as people are willing to give other humans the kind of authority that belongs only to God. So when you see a man preaching renunciation while living in luxury, when you encounter a leader demanding obedience but offering no accountability, when you meet someone who claims divine authority but demonstrates human corruption, what will you do? Will you stay silent like those at Bethel who saw but said nothing? Will you rationalize and justify like those who couldn't bear to see the truth? Or will you speak up, even when it costs you everything? That's the question Anthony Morris's story poses to all of us. Not just to Jehovah's Witnesses or ex-witnesses, but to anyone who has ever trusted a religious leader, joined an organization, or given their faith to a human institution. Do you believe power corrupts, or does it simply reveal what was always there? Does religious authority deserve special protection, or should it face even greater scrutiny? And what happens when faith becomes mixed with vanity, when devotion becomes indistinguishable from idolatry, when the messenger becomes more important than the message? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they're questions we must ask, especially in a world where religious leaders continue to demand absolute authority while demonstrating very human failures. The story of Anthony Morris III is more than just one man's fall from grace. It's a mirror held up to every religious organization, every power structure, every system that protects its leaders at the expense of its members. It's a reminder that vanity takes many forms, and the most dangerous form is the one that wears a spiritual mask. It's a warning that the loudest voices against worldliness are often the ones most seduced by it. And it's proof that in the end, truth has a way of emerging, no matter how many walls of silence we build around it. The vapor always dissipates. The illusion always fails. And when it does, we're left with the uncomfortable reality that the emperor never had any clothes at all. We just chose not to see it because seeing it would have cost us too much. But now the cost of not seeing has become too high. And that's why stories like this matter. That's why we need to tell them, share them, learn from them. Not out of vindictiveness or desire for revenge, but out of hope. Hope that the next generation will learn from these mistakes. Hope that people will trust their own eyes rather than institutional narratives. Hope that silence will give way to truth, and truth will lead to freedom. Because in the end, that's what this is all about. Freedom from systems that manipulate. Freedom from leaders who exploit. Freedom from organizations that demand everything and offer nothing but broken promises and empty theology. The story of Anthony Morris III is over. But the story of what we learn from it, that's just beginning.